This is Pastor Arik, and you're listening to The Clergy Corner. Welcome to episode 285 of this special podcast about life and faith. I'm your host, Eric Borstad, the pastor of Ankeny United Church in Ankeny, Iowa, and it is my hope that this will be a time of reflection, healing, and wholeness for you. Now, every so often, I will end up going down some random rabbit hole of information, and I find myself obsessed with some particular random subject. It'll always happen. I end up researching one thing, which leads me down the rabbit hole of another, and somehow the topic worms its way into my head until I find myself researching and reading more about it until my curiosity is satisfied. Now, all of that is to say that recently I fell down quite the deep rabbit hole when it comes to the history and the origins of lobotomies. Now, you might be asking, Pastor Arik, how on earth did you end up exploring that particularly gruesome topic? And the short answer is that I was doing some research into Carl Jung's idea of the collective unconscious. Now, I'll get into that more later, but I at least want to give you one of the big sources that I have for today, where this information comes from, essentially. It's a book titled The Lobotomist by Jack L. High. And Jack explores the dark history of lobotomies that's prevalent in this country, the origins, how they came to be popularized, and of course the disastrous consequences that destroyed countless people's lives. It is a fascinating, if particularly gut-wrenching, read that goes into depth into this dark period of American psychosurgery. Now, I promise I'm going to get somewhere with this, especially when it comes to spirituality, but I need to set the stage for you a little bit. For those who don't know, lobotomies arose as a psychosurgery, that is a surgical fix to try to address mental illness. And again, I put fix in the biggest air quotes of all time. But it was used as a fix for those struggling with all sorts of various mental illnesses. The procedure was developed and evolved over time, but the overall aim of the surgery was essentially the same, no matter how it was carried out. Lobotomies would target the frontal cortex of an individual's brain and either scoop out portions of it or damage it intentionally to pacify those struggling with mental illness. And so you might be assuming, certainly this procedure was done in a hospital setting with the proper equipment and licensing that is needed for surgery, of course carried out by a medical doctor. And I'd have to respond that no, in fact, many of these procedures were done in offices, and the surgery was not done by surgeons, but rather by psychiatrists. Yeah, horrific, right? And then you might be wondering, well, it must have been successful enough for it to get so popularized and so widespread. But again, the reality is that the success rate was under 30%. Under 30% saw an improvement in their symptoms, which was temporary. Sometimes people had to go back for 3 or 4 lobotomies throughout the course of their lives, while others saw no improvement at all, and then there was those whose lives ended up worse. And if you want an example of someone noteworthy who had what I would consider a botched lobotomy, then I'd recommend you look up the story of Rosemary Kennedy, JFK's sister, who had a lobotomy ordered by their father, right? He was the only one that needed to sign off on it. And it left her with the attributes and intellect of a 2-year-old child for the rest of her life. So hopefully I've set the scene for you a bit when it comes to the horrors of lobotomies. And I said I was going somewhere with this. I'm not trying to just traumatize you on purpose, I promise. But the thing that fascinated me the most, and the thing that I keep coming back to as I mull over this information, is that without exception, every single person that had a lobotomy, every person without fail, stopped attending houses of worship after their procedure. I want to say that again because when I saw this, it made my heart stop, and it really stopped me in my tracks. Out of all of those who had lobotomies, every single one stopped attending houses of worship after their procedure. Even if they were devoutly religious before, even to the point of mania or schizophrenic delusions of religious significance, whether the surgery was deemed successful or not, every single person who underwent a lobotomy never set foot in the house of worship again. To me, this is incredibly important and noteworthy, and I don't think this aspect of lobotomies has been explored enough. Those who have made note of it as a result have offhandedly referred to lobotomies as a surgery of the soul. But I think even in sort of the offhanded nature of that comment, I think it is more important, more significant than we realize. That after their surgery, the patient no longer feels a connection to something larger than themselves. They no longer have a connection to the divine, no matter their religion. And so they stop going to worship altogether. You know, it's often been debated, it has been discussed, it has been theorized. For those who believe in a soul, where does the soul reside? Right? Is it a physical presence in the body? Is it simply an ethereal, spiritual part of us without mass or measurable weight? And when we think about the soul, we often imagine the soul as being located in our heart, or at the very least, deep, deep down in the very core of our being. But this poses a question. What if the human soul is located in the frontal cortex of the brain? The place that controls things like empathy, compassion, and higher level thinking. What if, by cutting away at a person's frontal cortex, lobotomies actually cut away at a person's soul? And there's some research that might back this up in a way. For those who have been convicted of especially violent crimes, especially those suffering from psychopathy or sociopathy, many of them have been discovered to have had head trauma in their lives, or it just didn't develop, but they've had issues with their frontal cortex, whether it's injuries or it just didn't develop the way it should. And for those that had frontal cortex injuries, their personality seemed to have shifted following that trauma to the brain. No longer do they have empathy or compassion, two things that the frontal cortex controls, but rather they revert to more primal and selfish motivations. Many of the most renowned serial killers in history have had frontal cortex injuries, and maybe that's why it was so much easier for them to commit the violence that they did. So again, what if the soul resides in the frontal cortex of our brains? And this can be supported by the idea of Carl Jung's idea of the collective unconscious. That's sort of what got me down this rabbit hole to begin with, was looking at that, and then it sort of led into this. For those who are unaware, the Jungian idea is that all human beings have this larger connection to one another and to the larger collective unconscious, which I could argue could also be called God, that ties us all together. Or to put it sort of in a modern example that might make more sense to us, imagine that each person is a device that is connected to the internet as a whole, which is the collective unconscious. And so our frontal cortex of the brain is like our wireless receiver that picks up on that signal. And this would explain the phenomenon that we've heard about in the past when someone might wake up from a coma after a head injury, and all of a sudden they can speak a different language fluently or can play an instrument that they've never touched before in their lives. The explanation would be, therefore, that after the brain injury, the receiver, their frontal cortex of the brain in this case, started picking up on another wireless signal that was different from their own. Now they can do things they've never been able to do before because that wireless signal got mixed up with another. So if we take the possibility that the soul resides in the frontal cortex, then it makes the surgical act of lobotomies even more horrific, as we acknowledge it becomes a true surgery of a person's soul. So if you want to creep out your friends at the next gathering, feel free to pass along this information or just bring it up to them as a topic of conversation. I'm sure they'd love it. My mind has been swirling with these thoughts over the past week, and I've had no one to talk to about it, so because you're my captive audience, apologies, but now you've had to put up with my musings as well. And again, if you want to learn more about this phenomenon or this surgery in particular, I'd encourage you to read The Lobotomist, but understandably, if you've learned enough about lobotomies for your taste, I can understand that as well. So my friends, regardless of where the soul resides, I invite us to give thanks that it is something that connects us to something larger than ourselves. Let us give thanks that it allows us to practice empathy and compassion. And let us embrace as the idea that we are more connected to one another than we realize. So until next time, be well, my friends. Amen. Thanks once again for listening. If you want to learn more about Ankeny UCC, go to ankenyucc.org. And if you want to write in a show suggestion or have any comments, you can send those emails to clergycornerpodcast@gmail.com.